Hello and welcome to the new raw umber bark drawing course. In this course you will learn how to draw a bark from start to finish. Along the way you will learn about materials, measuring, shading and finally finishing your drawing, providing you with a set of skills you can apply on any future drawings you do.
If you want change to happen in your work, you have to be willing to try something new and different and to think differently.
red and yellow and pink and green, orange and purple and blue. I can sing a rainbow, sing a rainbow, sing a rainbow with you.
Join Magdalena Kusowska as she paints 2 landscapes over 4 episodes. Along the way, you'll learn about materials, tools, techniques, and a whole load of handy hints. Available for streaming now at rawumberstudios.com/landscape.
Hello, my name is Neil Davidson and I'm the founder of Raw Umber Studios. Welcome to another online drawing session. This session mimics the structure of a regular life drawing class. We'll show you one or more photographs on the screen, and it's your job to draw what you see. We'll have an artist joining us, doing a demonstration and giving hints and tips. You can either follow their advice or do your own thing. It is entirely up to you. Once the session is finished, don't forget to post your work onto Instagram and hashtag it with #RawUmberLive. You can also download the reference photographs and watch this video again after the session is finished. So if the artist is going too fast for you, don't worry. You can watch the video now and then watch it again later on. Right, let's get started.
Hello everyone and welcome to this latest Raw Umber portrait drawing video. In this video, I'll be using some willow charcoal to draw the portrait on white paper. And I also like to use a charcoal pencil. Really like the General's brand, which is nice and soft and easy to erase. Finally, for blending, I like to use a blending tool. I use a selection of these. Feel free to use whatever you prefer to blend with. And of course, to erase, I like to use a putty rubber. And all of these materials can be found in the materials list below the video. Now today I'll be drawing a single 1 hour pose, and I want to recap the box method for drawing the portrait. Now when drawing the portrait, whatever position it's in, I always start with the center line. This is the line that goes from the middle of the forehead all the way down through the middle of the chin. And if I simplify this line to a straight line, I can see it's at a slight angle. And this is important because our brains can often trick us into thinking that something is straight. So I always check the angle of the center line first. Next, what I can do is look for the free verts of the face. Now these can be a little bit different on everybody, but in her case I can neatly divide the bottom of the chin to the bottom of the nose to top of the brow or the base of the top of the mask, to that base of the mask to the hairline into 3 equal parts. So I always tend to look for these measurements first because it's very easy to already see how they should sit on that center line. Another really useful measurement is the middle. In this case I can see the middle of that center line also is occupied by the eyes. So I can add another line there. Now in this video, I'll be using comparative measurement to measure the box and the rest of the drawing. And what this means is that I can compare a vertical to a horizontal measurement, for instance, on the picture and then on my page. So for instance, if I look at the side of the mask to the edge of the portrait, I can see that's just about as long as that middle of the eyes to the chin. Now if you want, you can even use a smaller comparative measurement to see where the center line sits. In this case I can see it's about 1/4 along the edge of the mask to the end of the mask. So now I've measured up my main areas and I know the angle of the center line. I can start looking for the box. And what I mean by the box of the head is that if you can imagine you'd be sculpting the head out of a ball of clay, it would have a front and it would have a side as well. And the way we can see the difference between the front plane and the side plane is looking for the edge of the mask or the start of the shadows. So using the mask as a way to indicate the front versus the side plane, I can see that the front plane is mostly in shadow, and if I just simplify this into a rough rectangle shape, I've already got the box of the front plane of the head. And the angle of the head can be drawn in different ways, depending on how I fill in the back of the head. So at the bottom here I've drawn two boxes and two front planes that seem very similar. But if I draw the rest of the box of the head upwards or downwards, we get a different angle to the head itself. Now using the line of the mask, which goes roughly from the eyes down to the ear, or up to the ear I should say, we can see that's a clear indicator of the box going upwards. And so I can copy this angle over and fill in the rest of the box. Now on top of this I can make some small changes, but this is really the essential structure that I use whenever I need to know the angle that a portrait is taking. And from here I'm going to show you how to break this down further. And there are some proportional rules that everybody has. Of course, everybody has different features, but everybody has the same essential bones. And that's what I'm going to be looking for first. Now, first I'm going to start looking for the ear, which should be halfway down that line that I drew earlier, which is indicated by the band of the mask. Now I can cross-check where the ear needs to be by checking how it measures up against the features. For instance, I can see that the bottom of the ear should be roughly in line with the nose there. Now in front of the ear, the jawline starts. This is of course slightly different on everybody, so I'm just looking at the angle here. But what everybody has in common is that the jawline starts just in front of the ear and narrows down towards the chin. The neck will always start just behind that ear, which is the location of something called the mastoid muscle. Now if I want, I can also use the mask as a way to start breaking down his portrait a bit further. And for this again, I'm trying to look for symmetry. I'm trying to use that center line. So mentally, I'm sort of deleting all of the frills of the mask, and I can see that the overall shape is more or less an arrow shape, deeper near the center, and it goes up towards the wings of the mask. So I'm first going to try and simplify this shape. I can also see it drops down to about the bottom of the nose, just a little higher. And of course it narrows around the sides as well. So working like this gives me something to grab onto structure-wise before adding in all of the smaller planes and angles of the mask. This also helps me find things like the nose, which should be along that center line. And when I really simplify it, it's more or less a wedge shape. So as you can see, I'm jumping around here, going from big areas to smaller areas. I'm always looking for the underlying structure. I'm always, again, thinking of if I were to be a sculptor, would I start by sculpting the mask? I would actually start by sculpting the bigger areas first and then moving on to smaller areas. So before I start breaking stuff down a bit further, I'm going to look at the hair and the hairline as well. Now with the hair, you can be a bit looser, because of course it's a bit more movable than the structure of the bones of the portrait. But I still try to follow the way that the hair flows and falls over the skull, making sure it has a bit of volume and it's not overlapping or very close to the skull there. Alright, so now I've got my framework in. What I can do now is spend a few moments just adjusting some of these shapes if I see that I've made a small mistake, or a big mistake of course. And while I'm doing this, if you have any questions, feel free to let me know here in the comments if you're watching this live. Now the next thing I'm gonna do is start looking at dark versus light shapes. And the reason for this is that at the very start of the drawing, I could see the difference between the front plane and the side plane by looking at the shadows. And so looking at shadow versus light shapes or dark versus light shapes is a very useful way of being able to draw anything without having to draw in all the details. And the first and obvious choice is of course the black mask. I'm just using my willow here to fill it in, and note that I'm using parallel strokes here. This gives a sense of atmosphere rather than if I just go in any which direction or overlap my strokes. I can also use a blending tool if I find that it's got a bit too much texture there, but this is completely optional. Now the way I think about light and dark here is in terms of little puzzle shapes. For instance, if we look at the shape of the nose, which is a very specific triangle shape, you can see that's much easier to draw than the nostrils and the bridge of the nose and the eyes and the detail of the mask. Now I can do the same thing for the mouth area, which is pretty much all in shadow. There may be different things in there like the mouth and the fold of the cheek, but ultimately all of these areas are darker than the side plane of the head. Now another trick that the brain can play on us is adjusting to the local tones. So for instance, when we look at the mouth, we can see a lot of detail there, but when I outline the big shadow shape here on the image, we can see just how big and how dark that shadow shape is compared to the light shapes on the side of the head. So again, using the mantra of big things first, smaller things later. I'm going to first look for this big shadow shape, and then later I'm going to start breaking it down into smaller shapes. Now this may feel very uncomfortable and counterintuitive at first, so if you like you can also add a few lines in that shadow shape to keep some of the drawing. But I also promise that we will break this down later in the drawing and will all come together. And again, while I'm breaking down these shadow shapes into big blocks of darkened light, if you have any questions while I'm doing this, feel free to let me know here in the comments if you're watching this live. And the reason why I draw this way, using big abstract shapes, is that it really simplifies the drawing process. Often we feel like we can draw a triangle or a square, but we can't draw a nose or an ear. But ultimately, everything in the face is made up of these abstract shapes. So once we get these shapes right, the face will automatically start to appear. And this is the same with outlines. A lot of drawing is trying to stop your brain from playing tricks on yourself. And something that the Impressionists found out is that outlines don't really exist. All that we see is just patches of color on our retina. And the way this relates to drawing is that when we feel like we see an outline, all we really see is patterns of dark and light shapes. So what we need to do is stop our brain from letting it see that outline and instead try to just focus on these big shapes of light and dark. And this is actually much quicker and easier, and also really helps with painting, because painting is doing exactly the same thing. And for instance, when I'm looking at the cheek, the light shape of the cheek here, it's also much easier for me to judge an abstract shape than it is for me to judge the line of the jaw. For instance, I can see that shape is a bit too narrow, and all I need to do is just drop down that darker shape near the ear. Now at the moment we've got a framework of shapes, and I'm going to start breaking this down further. And for this, instead of using outlines, I'm again using shapes, but of shapes of different tones. Now this is a good point where I can start using my compressed charcoal, which goes a bit darker. And when I draw something on the bottom right here, you can see that I've really been working with only two tones or values, the darks of the willow charcoal and the lights of the paper. Now if I add my willow charcoal to this, and I can add this into my shadows to give it a bit more variety. And note that I'm still keeping the big separation of light shapes versus dark shapes, but I'm just adding a bit of variety to this. And again, I'm just using the same system of going from big shapes to small shapes. But now I'm just adding an extra tone into my tonal arrangement. So for instance, now looking at the mask, I can start adding a few more details in there, still keeping it fairly broad, but making it just a bit more specific. For instance, adding in the shape of her eyelashes on the side here, and the shape of the hole in the mask on the other side. Then once I'm happy with that shape, I can just darken the whole mask to get back to drawing using dark and light shapes rather than outlines. So now I've darkened the mask. You can see that a little bit of detail is starting to form, but really I'm still just looking at these abstract shapes. So I'm now going to move my way down the rest of the shadow. I'm going to start adding some darker shapes in the mouth area as well. When looking for the mouth, I tend to divide the bottom of the nose to the bottom of the chin into 3 equal parts, with the first line from the bottom of the nose being the dividing line of the lips. Now using my darker compressed charcoal, or you can simply use a bit of willow and press a bit more to make it darker, I can outline and draw out all of the small shapes in the mouth area before blending them together using my blending tool. And this is also another really useful thing about compressed charcoal. As you can see, it doesn't really blend in that well. So when I blend it in using my blending tool, in this case a hot brush, it lets me soften some of these shapes without losing them altogether. And this is something that can be really useful when drawing, because sometimes you want to make a few notes, but then soften some of these shapes. Because up until now, I've really been trying to be very clear about these shapes, but in real life, of course, sometimes they're a bit more unclear, a bit more fuzzy. Now what I can do with the compressed charcoal is outline these shapes, and then use my blending tool to fuzz it into the light without actually losing that drawing. For instance, here on the side of the mouth, it's actually quite a soft shape, and I can try and erase this using my rubber, but it can actually be a bit too harsh. So instead, I'm gonna just use my blending tool and get a nice gradation there. And because of the compressed charcoal being a bit stronger, the willow will erase and blend a bit better, but the compressed charcoal will still be very clear. Now for those of you blending using a brush like me, something that is a little bit counterintuitive and may not be immediately obvious is that the softest brushes actually take off the most charcoal, whereas a rough brush will take almost no charcoal off the paper. So in this case I'm using an old hog brush, which counterintuitively is actually a lot softer on the paper than a soft synthetic brush. I'm just going to work my way down here, again looking at abstract shapes, for instance the abstract shape of the jacket here, and then making sure I choose either a lighter shadow shape or a darker tone for these dark shapes. So again, it's just a puzzle of abstract shapes, but this time I'm deciding if it's a darker dark or a lighter dark. And I apply the same principle throughout the drawing, including the hair. Now the hair actually has a lot of different tones in there, and it can also be confusing because of course it's pink, but ultimately we can see that the highlight is much brighter and the hair is darker at the roots. So I'm first going to use a darker tone around the root area, and then I can later pull out the highlights using the rubber for the highlights. And this method of actually putting down a whole bunch of charcoal and then getting the drawing back can again feel a little bit counterintuitive. This is because a lot of us have spent a lot of time making sure the drawing is just right, and then don't feel comfortable just getting rid of that using a tone. But actually sometimes just going over your drawing with a tone and then pulling this drawing back out can be a way that can really push your drawing to the next level and can actually be easier than you think. Now if you've drawn it once, you know you can draw it again, so I wouldn't be too worried about losing a drawing. For instance, here with the ear, I've just added a dark shape there, and now I can start pulling out the highlights of the ear using my rubber. And I can do the same thing with the hair, for instance. Instead of having to outline all of the individual strands, which can actually make the hair feel a little busy and give it too much detail and focus, because ultimately I want the viewer to look at the features and not at the hair itself. So instead what I can do is just add a general darker tone into the whole of the hair. And once I've got these abstract shapes, I can go in using the rubber and just carve out a bit of the texture and a bit of the highlight. Now I can flick the rubber to indicate the strands of hair, and this can often be enough to indicate hair to the viewer without having to draw every strand of hair. So now I've been working with losing the drawing and abstract shapes. There's one more trick that can again feel a little bit uncomfortable, but is actually a very useful way of getting a realistic drawing. And that's the concept of softening. Now, our eye is always attracted to clear shapes, but actually a lot of the shapes in the figure or in a portrait are not as clear as we think. Our brain sort of connects up the dots in order to make them comprehensible to us, but really we don't actually see them. This is called a lost or a soft edge. Now, for instance, when we're looking at the hairline, we can imagine where it starts, but we don't actually see a line there. And so what I'm going to do is use a parallel stroke, in this case a horizontal stroke. I'm just going to go over my drawing, softening all of these areas to make them a little bit more vague. Now once I've done this, I can then go on with the rubber and add some texture strokes to indicate that highlight again. This can be enough to indicate that hair. I'm just going to work my way down and do this in other areas of the drawing, keeping this parallel stroke, trying to keep it as neat as I can. And the point of this sort of stroke is something that the old masters have been doing in their etchings for a long time. If you use a very unobtrusive parallel stroke throughout the whole of the drawing, this indicates a sense of atmosphere and unimportance. And while this may seem like something you don't want in your drawing, actually making large areas of your drawing feel unimportant to the viewer is very important, because that makes the other areas that you do want the viewer to look at to feel more important. So for instance, right now I've just added this parallel stroke to most of the outline. And what this does is bring the viewer's eye towards the mask and the nose and the eyes, which is where I want the viewer to look. Now this sort of parallel stroke combines really well with a more directional stroke. And that's something I'm doing right now along the outline of the mask. I'm not really trying to copy every last bit of the mask, I'm rather just adding a little bit of detail around the edges to indicate the pattern. Now at any point, if I feel if something comes out a bit too much, I can again use my widow charcoal and the parallel strokes to knock it back into the background and make it feel a little bit more integrated with the rest of the drawing. And it's a little bit of a back and forth here, adding some shapes using my compressed charcoal, and then adding softs by adding these parallel strokes and maybe a bit of blending tool as well. And I can use the same method for highlights as well. Often it feels like the white of the paper is not quite white enough, or you may feel like it's not really jumping out the way you'd like to. And counterintuitively, the answer often is to make the rest of the light a bit darker, so the highlight can really jump out. And that's what I'm doing right now on the tip of the nose. You can see that now I've darkened a lot of the light. I could just pull out a little bit of highlight and it really jumps out a lot more than it did before. So I can gently go over the rest of my lights as well and try and make those feel a little darker in order to be able to pull out the highlights more later on. And this comes back to what I was doing earlier in the drawing, which is losing some of the drawing in order to find some of the lights again in the ear. And I did this quite roughly at the time, but now I can start really drawing that ear in. So again, I've softened it using my blending tool, and now I can go in and just draw out all of the small areas of the ear using my compressed charcoal. Now I do have an ear video for those of you who'd like to draw ears, because they can be very tricky, so feel free to check that out if you have a subscription. But for now, I'm just looking for the outer shell of the ear with some of the inner structures. And then once I've got these drawn in, I can then start looking at the shapes again. So darkening some of these shapes using my willow charcoal. And softening it using my blending tools. And finally adding over this parallel stroke to make it feel integrated with the rest of the drawing in some places, so it doesn't stand out too much. So using this method of first looking for the shapes, then softening it, drawing the shapes in again, softening it again, is a really useful way to build up the tones, build up the detail, and also give yourself a lot of creative freedom while doing so. Instead of just copying what we see, we're now choosing what to leave out, what to soften, and what to give more detail. And this also allows you to then be a bit more artistic in your portraiture. So for instance, in my case, I want the mask and the nose to be the main areas of focus of my drawing. And so I am adding a few directional lines in the hair, but I'm keeping it fairly unobtrusive, so the viewer will keep looking at the mask and the nose rather than those areas. The same thing with the mouth. Even though there's a lot of detail inside that shadow, it's not really the part that I want the viewer to focus on. So I'm going to use my parallel stroke to let this blend in with the rest of the drawing and even with the background. And if you're brave enough, feel free to do this as well. Try to drag your parallel stroke all along the outline into the background, losing some of the drawing in there. And this can actually give a wonderful sense of atmosphere and interaction with the background, rather than just have a portrait that feels pasted on top of that background. And the more I can soften some of these darks, the more detail I can put into the lights. For instance, now I could just add a few marks in my lights that suggest some of that texture and will suggest some of that detail in the mask and the hairline. And because I've darkened everything else and softened everything else, these marks really jump out. Now, as a last note before we end the video, it may be tempting to add the light in the shadow. For instance, there's quite a lot at the bottom of the chin here. But often when I put this in, I find that it starts competing with my highlights. And it's often an area where you don't really want the viewer to look. So for instance, if I put this in here, it starts actually flattening the drawings a little bit. So instead of lightening these areas, try darkening the areas below it or next to it in order to make it feel lighter. So for instance, by adding this darker tone below the chin, I've made the chin feel a little bit lighter, which to me works better because this is an area where I don't really want any highlights. Alright, so we're almost at the end of the pose. So I'm just going to continue trying to look for areas where I want to soften it and areas where I want to add some detail. In the meantime, if you have any questions, let me know in the comments, or otherwise I will speak to you at the end of the pose. Alright, so that brings us to the end of this hour-long pose. I hope that you've enjoyed watching this and learning about tones and how to create atmosphere, as well as of course a recap of the box method I like to use to construct a portrait. And finally, if you enjoyed this video and would like to learn more about how to draw the figure and the portrait, consider taking out a subscription. There'll be more information here in the chat. Now, if you'd like to show us your work, feel free to use the photograph button here in the chat or use the hashtag #RawUmberLife if you use Instagram.
I hope you enjoyed the session and thank you for taking part. Don't forget to post your works onto Instagram and hashtag them with #RawUmberLife. We run 2 sessions a week, a figure drawing session every Wednesday at 8 PM and portrait drawing every Sunday at 4 PM. The last portrait session of every month is free. Thank you and goodbye.